Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal when the dazzling lights inside the chapel finally faded, when the last hurried footsteps of the guests left only silence in their wake. Willow stood alone at the altar, engulfed in the most deafening stillness of her life. In that moment, she understood collapse in its rawest form. Not simply the end of a wedding, not merely a rejected ceremony, but the complete unraveling of every fragile thread she had tried to weave into something resembling stability. Her dignity, her love, her sense of purpose as a mother, all of it came crashing down around her in the span of one breathless afternoon. It wasn't just the humiliation of walking away from the man she was supposed to marry. It was the realization that everything she had tried to protect and preserve had turned to ash before her very eyes. And worst of all, the man she had once trusted with the most vulnerable parts of herself, the man who had held her hand in the darkest hours, had become her most formidable threat. Willow once believed that leaving Drew would be the key to redemption. That by severing ties with him, she could start over, beg for Michael's forgiveness, and slowly rebuild a life where she could once again hold her children. But Drew wasn't content to let her go. He wasn't merely a jilted lover clinging to bitterness, he was the keeper of the secret that could destroy her. Beneath all the polished smiles and political savvy, Drew held the one truth that, if revealed, would ensure that Willow would never again be allowed near Wiley or Amelia. And that secret was darker than anything Willow had ever confessed, not to Michael, not to Nina, not even to herself in moments of agonizing guilt. Years ago, in a spiral of grief and abandonment, Willow had done the unthinkable. Driven by fear, jealousy, and the unbearable weight of feeling replaced, she had orchestrated the disappearance of Daisy, Michael and Sasha's daughter. It wasn't a calculated crime, but a moment of madness. A decision born out of desperation to preserve her place in a life that was slipping from her grasp. She believed that if Daisy were gone, if Sasha retreated with her into some distant silence, Michael might still see Willow as the center of his family. And so she made it happen. Quietly. Strategically. Disastrously. She ensured that Sasha and Daisy vanished from Port Charles, manipulating events from behind the scenes so that no one suspected her involvement. And for years, that secret remained buried, lodged deep in the icy waters of her memory, untouched, undisturbed, until Drew found it. He didn't confront her with fury. That would have been too easy. Instead, he used it. Controlled her with it. Manipulated her under the guise of love and understanding, offering her security while keeping that blade to her throat. With one word, one piece of evidence, Drew could turn her world upside down. He could go to Michael, to the courts, to the press, and expose her for what she had done. A restraining order, a media storm, a permanent revocation of her parental rights, all of it was within his reach. And Willow knew that. She felt it every time she looked into his eyes and saw not love, but leverage. It was then that fear mutated into hatred. Hatred not just for Drew, but for herself, for the weakness that had brought her here. Willow realized she could no longer live shackled to a man who viewed her as a pawn. She would not spend the rest of her life negotiating access to her children with someone who saw her past as a bargaining chip. She needed to act, not in defense, but in destruction. She chose not escape, but war. Willow began to gather ammunition. Quietly, methodically, she peeled back the layers of Drew's public persona. She studied his financial records, poked holes in his humanitarian image, and tracked down connections that were never meant to see the light. The charitable foundations he championed, the overseas investments he kept hidden, the whispered rumors in backrooms about insider dealings, each thread she followed gave her more power. What Drew believed were secrets, Willow turned into daggers. She didn't issue warnings or make bold declarations. Instead, she planted seeds. Uncertainties in the minds of those closest to him. Carly, once Drew's most stalwart ally, began to question his recent dealings. Sonny, ever the wary strategist, noticed odd patterns in Drew's behavior around certain business ventures. Even Jason, Drew's own brother, sensed an unfamiliar dissonance in his tone. These weren't coincidences. They were the result of Willow's careful sabotage, a slow burn that would eventually consume the image Drew had so painstakingly crafted. But it wasn't enough to merely expose him. Willow wanted him broken, stripped of the mask he wore in public. She wanted Drew to feel the same isolation that had haunted her nights, the same betrayal that had once carved open her chest and left her gasping. She wanted to take from him the very things he valued most, his credibility, his reputation, and his illusion of control. As the rumors mounted, Drew found himself increasingly cornered. Contracts were stalled. Philanthropic endorsements were withdrawn. People began to whisper. The media, once his ally, turned inquisitive. Willow never stepped into the light. She remained in the shadows, letting Drew unravel on his own, letting the pressure mount until every breath he took was laced with panic. And yet, even as she succeeded, even as she watched Drew stumble and falter, Willow began to feel something more terrifying than guilt, detachment. She had always believed that her actions, however dark, were justified by the love she bore for her children. But now, as she stood before her own reflection, as she traced the lines of wear across her face and the coldness in her eyes, she realized she had become someone unrecognizable. Her humanity had withered in the pursuit of revenge. Her maternal instincts had been weaponized. Her sense of justice had been drowned by necessity. She had destroyed Drew. But in doing so, she had burned away the last remnants of herself. She was no longer the woman who had once cradled Wiley to sleep, whispering promises of safety and love. She was no longer the woman who cried when Amelia took her first steps. She was someone else now. A survivor. A fighter. A mother armed with secrets and desperation. Willow knew the cost of her choices would follow her forever. Even if she succeeded in reclaiming visitation rights, even if Michael offered her forgiveness one day, the truth would always be a shadow behind her. She had done what she thought was necessary, but the victory was hollow. The chapel, once meant to be a place of union and hope, now stood as a mausoleum for everything she had lost. And in that silence, in that devastating awareness of what could never be undone, Willow accepted her new reality. She was not the bride. She was not the beloved. She was not the forgiven. She was the storm that blew through her own life and shattered it, piece by piece. In the suffocating shadows of her own calculated schemes, Willow began to lose pieces of herself she once thought inviolable. The gentle mother who once cradled her children with trembling hands and whispered bedtime lullabies was dissolving into someone unrecognizable. The warmth in her heart, once fueled by hope and love, had cooled into something sharp and unyielding. She no longer trembled at the sound of Drew's name, no longer recoiled in shame at the memory of her own sins. Fear, once her constant companion, had been replaced by an icy resolve that hardened with each passing day. She was no longer the woman who sought forgiveness. She had become a warrior carved by betrayal, shaped by necessity, and armored in her determination to protect the only sacred thing she had left, her children. Willow understood that as long as Drew remained untouched, as long as he moved through the world cloaked in righteousness, he would hold power over her life. He would always wield that secret like a dagger just out of sight, ready to strike, ready to sever her from Wiley and Amelia forever. She couldn't allow that. She wouldn't. So, she turned her grief into fuel, her guilt into strategy, and her fear into weaponry. And she set her sights on him, not to beg, not to bargain, but to hunt. She began subtly, planting doubts in the minds of those around him. A whisper here, a forged document there. The media was her battleground now, and she manipulated it with chilling finesse. She leaked unverified but plausible stories that Drew had seduced Nina for the sole purpose of infiltrating her business empire and gaining influence over Metro Court shares. The public didn't need proof, just the hint of corruption was enough to spark chaos. Willow fed the fire, feeding select reporters just enough scandal to let them run wild with speculation. Headlines began to shift. Drew's once unassailable image as a war hero turned business magnate started to crack under the pressure of suspicion. But she didn't stop there. She crafted an even darker narrative, suggesting that Drew, under the guise of helping, had manipulated Sasha during her lowest point, pushing her into signing off on financial decisions that ultimately destabilized deception. She invented paper trails, hinted at accounts and shell companies, orchestrated an illusion so meticulously layered it felt authentic. These weren't wild accusations shouted into the void. These were stories that appeared organic, surfacing from seemingly independent sources, threading themselves into the public consciousness like weeds through stone. And behind it all, silently and invisibly, stood Willow. Pulling every string, curating every leak, watching her former lover's empire crumble one carefully placed rumor at a time. Yet with every blow she dealt to Drew, she felt a numbness growing inside her. What began as a mission to reclaim her children's future was slowly mutating into something bleaker, a war not only against Drew, but against the part of herself that had ever believed in second chances. She once defined herself by love, for Michael, for Wiley, for Amelia. Now, she was defined by survival, by vengeance, by a quiet ruthlessness that consumed her like a spreading frost. Nights were no longer for dreaming, but for dissecting vulnerabilities and planning attacks. She no longer wept, she calculated. She no longer begged the universe for peace, she plotted ways to engineer it. Every morning, she would stare into the mirror, searching for a trace of the woman she once was, but all she saw were eyes clouded with shadow, with sleeplessness, with the exhaustion of carrying so many lies. Her reflection had become unfamiliar, her skin pale under the weight of secrets, her expression locked in a permanent grimace of control. She had morphed into something colder, sharper, something Drew himself would have admired if he weren't the target. And in that transformation came a cruel revelation: she had become a version of him. Calculating. Detached. Merciless. Only, Drew had done it for advancement, for wealth, for control. Willow did it for something more primal. She did it for survival. For the right to stand in a park and watch her children play without fearing they'd be taken from her. For the chance to be present when Amelia needed comfort or Wiley needed guidance. For the sliver of a future where she might matter to them again. Her ruthlessness wasn't ambition, it was desperation wrapped in iron. But it came at a cost. The children she fought so hard to protect, would they recognize her if they saw her now? Would they feel safe in the arms of a woman who had traded compassion for cunning? Willow wasn't sure. She knew only that she had crossed a line and that there was no turning back. The purity of her love had been stained by the means she chose to wield it. She had become both shield and sword, defender and destroyer. And yet, in the quietest moments, when the chaos of her plans settled briefly, she mourned. She mourned the woman who had once hoped that love could fix everything, who once believed that truth and forgiveness could mend even the most broken bonds. That woman was gone. In her place stood a strategist, a force, a storm. And while the world may one day forget what Drew did to her, Willow would never forget what she had done to herself in the name of motherhood. This was her new identity. Not mother, not lover, not victim, but avenger. And though she told herself it was all for Wiley and Amelia, she knew that part of her fought simply because she could no longer bear the thought of ever being powerless again. When Michael first began to hear whispers circulating about Drew, rumors that painted the man in shades of manipulation and corruption, he dismissed them. At first, he chalked them up to the usual gossip that followed anyone in power. He had known Drew too long, seen him navigate war zones and boardrooms alike with unflinching integrity. It didn't make sense. But the murmurs grew louder, more persistent, and unsettlingly specific. Headlines began to shift. Colleagues turned cautious. Carly hesitated before defending Drew. Even Sonny grew distant. And that was when something deep in Michael's instincts stirred, something he hadn't felt since the last time his world turned upside down. He began to investigate. The more Michael pulled at the threads, the more tangled they became. On the surface, it appeared that Drew was collapsing under the weight of poor decisions, but the timing, the precision of each blow to his reputation, it all felt too clean, too orchestrated. Financial irregularities surfaced in rapid succession. Witnesses appeared, conveniently, to confirm suspicions. Anonymous tips flooded journalists' inboxes. This wasn't a coincidence, this was a campaign. And though the puppet strings were nearly invisible, Michael could sense a hand guiding it all. One name kept rising in his mind, one possibility he dreaded to confirm but could no longer ignore. Willow. It wasn't a matter of proof. It was a matter of intuition, of knowing someone so deeply that even their silences became familiar. Michael remembered the way Willow used to cry in the middle of the night, quietly, so she wouldn't wake the children. He remembered the flash of pain in her eyes when she looked at Drew after learning about Nina. He remembered the tension that never left her shoulders, even when she smiled. And now, in hindsight, all of it took on a new shape. The heartbreak had never truly healed. The betrayal had never been buried. And the desperation she carried like a second skin had finally transformed into something else, something ruthless. As Michael began to connect the dots, the dissonance tore at him. This was the woman who had once looked at Wiley like he was the son. The woman who had whispered dreams of family and forgiveness through every cracked moment in their past. But now, her fingerprints were faintly visible on the collapse of a man who once stood between her and her shame. Could he really believe she had done all of this? Had she truly become the architect of Drew's downfall? And if so, was it out of malice, or was it something even more dangerous, fear? Michael stood on the edge of a moral cliff, pulled between memory and reality, between love and duty. He wanted to believe that Willow was still somewhere within that hardened exterior, that the woman who once begged for redemption had not fully become the shadow she now resembled. But what if he was wrong? What if letting her near the children again was not an act of mercy but a risk that they, too, would be swallowed by the chaos she now embodied? Meanwhile, across town, Willow stood frozen in front of her bedroom mirror, the pale morning light creeping over her shoulders like a judgmental ghost. The wind howled softly through the slightly cracked window, its chill brushing against her skin, but she didn't move. Her eyes, hollow and unblinking, stared into her reflection, searching for some remnant of the woman she once was. She found none. The soft lines of her face had sharpened. The curve of her lips held no warmth. The color in her cheeks was no longer from laughter but from the tension she wore constantly like a second skin. What stared back at her was not a victim, not a grieving lover, not a gentle mother. It was a survivor sculpted by necessity, forged in silence, and honed by guilt. She knew what she had done. She had pushed Drew to the brink, and in doing so, she had crossed boundaries she could never uncross. There was no reclaiming innocence, no retreat into the past. Her war had turned into a labyrinth, one she could no longer navigate, one with no exit and no forgiveness waiting at the center. But despite the darkness that clung to her like smoke, one truth burned with unwavering clarity: if she couldn't protect her right to be a mother, then nothing else mattered. Without Amelia and Wiley, her existence was a shell. They were not just her children. They were her compass, her salvation, the only proof that something good could still come from the wreckage of her life. And so, Willow let go of the last vestiges of remorse. If the world saw her as a villain, so be it. She had tried being the penitent, the wounded, the patient redeemer. But kindness hadn't saved her. Compassion had not defended her from Drew's quiet blackmail. Silence had not brought her closer to Michael's trust. It was action that had kept her standing. It was strategy, not virtue, that had opened a path, however narrow, toward the children she loved with terrifying intensity. If she had to be feared in order to be heard, if she had to be hated in order to be near her children, she would bear that burden. She would wear the villain's crown if it meant protecting the only thing left in her life worth protecting. Outside, the cold grew stronger, and the first flakes of morning frost etched their way across the windowpane. But Willow remained motionless, her breath slow and deliberate. She was no longer pleading for understanding. She was no longer hoping to be rescued. That chapter had ended. What remained now was clarity, an unrelenting purpose that pulsed through her veins with each beat of her heart. She was finished with guilt. Finished with waiting. Finished with bending for a world that had already condemned her in whispers and glances. From this point on, she would not ask for permission. She would not kneel. She would not apologize. She would act. Even if it meant becoming everything they feared she was. And so, in the final silence that followed her transformation, Willow understood the price of survival. She had shed her innocence piece by piece, surrendered the gentle soul she once was in exchange for the armor she now wore. She had crossed moral boundaries that once seemed sacred, blurred the line between justice and vengeance until neither could be clearly defined. The woman who once trembled at the thought of being judged now welcomed the condemnation, if it meant securing even a sliver of access to her children's world. Wiley's laughter and Amelia's small hands were no longer just dreams, they were her singular purpose, her reason to keep breathing amid the wreckage she had created. But even with her new resolve, even with the cunning she had honed and the power she now wielded in whispers and shadows, Willow knew that some damage could never be undone. Michael might never look at her the same way again. Wiley, when older, might one day hear fragments of the truth and question the woman who once held him so close. Amelia, so young and unaware, might grow up sensing the quiet storm that followed her mother into every room. And Willow accepted this, because for her, love no longer meant innocence, it meant sacrifice. It meant bearing the hatred of the world if that hatred created a space for her children to live unscathed.